Okay, class, first let me apologize for this. As you're gonna have to see, I keep a day job and I have to kind of get things done when I can get them done. So I'm actually recording one of the lectures during my lunch break and I'm doing it on my phone, and this is kind of awkward. Hopefully, tomorrow, when I finish the rest of the lectures, I'll either be able to do those at home or I will have my office to myself and be able to do them there. But we're going to do our finance lecture from a recording on my cell phone, which is always which is always fun. But so again, as I said earlier, I don't spend too much time rehashing what's actually in your textbook. I expect you guys to read your textbook, but these are some other notes that I'm going to share from another source that I have used in the past. So as far as what your budget is, and I think a lot of this will probably not be that new to a lot of you. But basically, your budget is just in layman's terms a look of what your revenues are going to be, what the money is that is coming in, and what your expenditures are going to be, or the monies that are leaving. So, when we look at our budgets, what we want to do is kind of line up as close as possible our expenditures and our revenues. We want to be close as far as how much money we're taking in and how much money we are spending. And I say that for one reason, to say that sometimes people will tell you it's good practice to actually spend less money than you are bringing in. And definitely in the for-profit industry, you're going to want to do that. But when it comes to libraries, that's not necessarily the case. What people do a lot of times, what funding agencies will do, is look at how much money is being brought in and whether or not that money is being spent. And if a department or agency is not spending as much money as it's being allocated to spend, that agency may actually be given fewer funds the next year because the funding agency might determine that that agency doesn't need all the money that it has been allocated. So it is actually good practice with your libraries to spend as much money as you bring in. So to have expenditures that are equal to your revenues, but you also don't want to go over budget. Also, it is good practice to keep maybe 5 or 10% of the budget as some reserve money, some general fund money, and that's because things tend to go wrong. Technology is a good example of that. You are going to have those situations come up where it is the middle of tax time, and what do you know, your printer has gone down, and that is just a nightmare in the middle of tax season. But technology isn't always reliable, and so there are going to be things, including technology, where you're going to want to have money in your reserves so that you can take care of some unexpected things, and you will have some unexpected things come up as a manager. Now we're going to talk very quickly about types of budgets. Your main type of budget for your general fiscal year type of budget, your fiscal year also will generally be, not always, but will often be from the summer of one year to the summer of the next year. And generally, your regular fiscal year budget, that's what's called the operations budget, and that's going to have your revenues and expenditures and what's going to take you through a fiscal year. There are long-term budgets that are called capital budgets, and generally those are for capital improvements, and those can include things that are being done to improve the library over the course of a few years, especially if you're actually building a new library, but also if you're making add-ons and things to libraries, and these are generally going to be one-time costs. So it's not like where you're going to have that recurring budget item for your operations budget. You're going to have that recurring personnel budget line. You're not going to have that with your with your capital budget, you're going to have, generally those are going to be one-time capital improvements. And capital budgets can actually account for as much as 20 to 30 years of time. So we're going to be we're going to be focusing right now on your operations budget. Most of the time, your operations budget is going to be what they call a line item budget. And that's the budget that, if you ever worked with budgets, that's typically what you're seeing. You're going to have your revenues and then your expenditures. And then also, generally, you're going to have your, for that current year, that current fiscal year, you're going to have your projected revenues and expenditures, and then also line item budgets oftentimes also have the proposed and actual budgets from the previous fiscal year, so that you can sort of gauge how things went the previous year, and you can make improvements or modifications to make things run a little smoother in the next cycle. Okay, moving right along. Sorry. All these notes that I take, I do it for you, and I hope that I'm not disturbing my coworkers, but if I am, maybe they deserve it. Okay, so now we talk about all kinds of libraries, and I know that quite a few of you are actually school librarians or want to become school librarians. I read that on the discussion board. Now, for those of you, I would say that the biggest difference between academic libraries and public libraries when it comes to budgeting is really just where that money is coming from and who you're accountable to. If you're a public library, then you're funded usually through property taxes. That can change. Sometimes public libraries are actually funded through sales taxes, and then also there are rare examples where public libraries are parts of nonprofits and they don't necessarily draw money from the local community, but instead draw money from funding organizations. But generally, you're going to, in a public library, draw your revenues from property taxes. It is always good to get grants when you can, so always be on the lookout for grants. In academic libraries, generally, there is a line item for library expenditures, and then also, and that also comes from income tax revenue if it's a state library like USC would be, or a state university like USC would be, and then some of that money will also come from tuition and fees. If you have a small sort of liberal arts college, then a higher percentage of that money is going to come from, all that money is going to come from tuition and fees, unless you have some very generous donors who are donating the money. And then, for you guys who are trying to be a school media specialist, again, your revenues are typically going to come again from whatever entity your public education body is funded by. So if you have a school district that is funded by a county or a district within the county, then that's where your expenditures are coming from. And again, those are coming back from property taxes. Now, there are various things that various expenditures that your budgets are going to be devoted to, and those will include, for librarians, the biggest operating expense is always, I shouldn't say always, but 9 times out of 10 is going to be personnel budgeting, and generally 45 to 65% of library budgets come from personnel budgeting, and that includes paying salaries, wages, and benefits, and that includes everything from your administrator all the way down to your janitors and your support staff and things like that. Okay. And again, that's generally going to be about 45 to 65% of your operating budget. That may be a little different though with school media, I'm not sure, but definitely with your public and academic libraries, that tends to be the case. And as you guys already know, everyone who isn't considered a volunteer is going to have to be paid at least a minimum wage, but then there are other things that can alter how much personnel are paid, and that includes what benefits packages that you offer personnel and that sort of thing. Now, some other line items that tend to be within library budgets would include your too many notes. You are going to devote, of course, monies to materials. You're going to devote monies to information technology services. You're going to devote monies to professional development, which will include hosting. That'll include both hosting workshops and hosting trainings, as well as travel costs to send, especially professional librarians, to conferences and things like that. Then you're going to have some other general expenses here and there, which will include building maintenance, equipment maintenance, and office supplies and things of that nature. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the materials cost, because that is getting to be a big thing these days. So material costs. Since the turn of the millennium, really overall budgets, particularly in public libraries, but also in academic libraries generally, the overall budgets have stayed the same. But at the same time, the overall budgets for budgets for materials, have generally kind of stayed the same or dropped, both in public and academic libraries. But as that's been happening, costs for materials and costs for serials tend to be going up. And so this is kind of a horrible situation for libraries to be in. Our materials budgets are not going up as the costs are going up. They're either staying the same or they are going down. Materials budgets in public libraries tend to be about 20% of the budget. And that would include all materials, adult, children, young adult, all those sorts of things. In academic libraries, the materials budget is going to be a little bit higher. It tends to be about 30 to 35% of the total budget. Again, I'm not sure what those numbers are for school media, but you are going to have to be very savvy as far as how to spend money on materials, because again, material costs going up, but the materials budgets are going down or staying the same. One thing that you're going to want to do is budget wisely, and then always check with faculty. If you're in an academic library, check with the faculty, see what their demands and their needs are, and try to pinpoint what their needs are and support what their needs are. You can check book reviews and that sort of thing as well to sort of get a good feel of what's in demand, and that way the materials that you're selecting are relevant. Okay. Now, also, I do want to say for your public librarians here, please do not shortchange different areas, even on perceived need or perceived use or lack of use. When it comes to your public library, make sure you've got money devoted to teens, to children, and to adults. Don't shortchange anybody. Don't try to, if there is a need for adult materials, then don't just say, well, we perceive a bigger need for children's materials and we are going to radically shift money from adult materials to children's materials. You're going to need to maintain that proper balance if you're in the public library. And then finally, I've actually never dealt with a zero-based budget, and there's some reasons for that. But your book does mention zero-based budgets, and zero-based budgets are where you're basically starting off with that clean slate, and instead of considering last year's numbers and then trying to adjust based on last year's numbers, you are totally getting into it with the new. You're starting out at zero, and then you're determining what are the needs and what things may need a little less money, and then you are coming up with totally new numbers based on that. Zero-based budgeting, the thing with that is that zero-based budgeting is very time consuming, and that's probably the big reason why a lot of you are hopefully not going to do too much of it. It's very good because it does catch, especially it's very good for catching inflated budgets or inflated items within budgets. So if you're totally not knowing that you're spending too much money on, say, cereals because you've been doing it for so many years, but now a lot of the cereals that people used to look at in print in the library, they're now looking at those items online, for instance, Sports Illustrated or something like that. Um, the zero-based budgeting will help you catch some of the inflation there. But again, this is very time consuming and you're not going to have an abundance of time as a manager. And that's going to wrap it up for the budgeting piece. Hopefully I'll be in the comfort of an office when I record the rest of the lectures.